Why would an army send its fate into the hands of the one man everyone had already written off? That question haunted the command post long before the first shot of that day was fired. Because in every war, there are heroes with medals, officers with maps, and soldiers with rifles. But there are also men no one knows. Men whose names never appear in briefings. Men whose jobs seem so small that commanders barely remember they exist. This was one of those men. A messenger on foot. No rank that inspired respect. No weapon that inspired confidence. No reputation that suggested courage or brilliance. To the officers around him, he was dead weight. A necessary inconvenience at best. A liability at worst. In modern warfare, messages move through radios, wires, and encrypted signals. But this war was not modern where it mattered most. Terrain swallowed radio waves. Weather killed visibility. Artillery fire shredded communication lines faster than engineers could repair them. And when those systems failed, armies fell back on something ancient and dangerous. A human being carrying information through chaos. That was his role. Run, deliver, return, or don't return at all. The irony was brutal. Everyone depended on messages, yet no one respected the messenger. He was mocked openly. Officers joked that he ran slower than bullets and knew less than maps. Soldiers whispered that he was cursed, that wherever he was sent, things went wrong. He had been reassigned more times than anyone else in the unit, not because he was skilled, but because no one wanted him nearby. Each reassignment carried the same unspoken hope. Maybe this time he would disappear into the noise of war and stop being a problem. What made it worse was that he never defended himself. He didn't argue. He didn't boast. He didn't demand recognition. He listened, nodded, and waited for orders. That silence made others mistake him for weakness. In war, confidence is often louder than competence, and those who speak the least are assumed to know the least. That assumption would nearly get everyone killed. As the battle unfolded, the situation deteriorated faster than anyone predicted. Units advanced too far. Flanks stretched thin. Enemy movements became erratic, aggressive, almost desperate. Reports contradicted each other. Maps no longer matched reality. The command structure began to fracture under pressure. Orders issued in the morning were already obsolete by noon. And still, the messenger stood there, waiting, invisible, holding nothing but a satchel and a responsibility no one respected. What no one realized was that this man had already run more dangerous routes than any of them had planned on paper. He knew the terrain not from maps, but from scars. He knew where shells tended to fall, where enemy patrols liked to hide, where time itself seemed to slow under fire. He had learned these things the hard way, without instruction, without praise, and without backup. Every insult he swallowed had sharpened his focus. Every dismissal had taught him something. Officers never learn from behind lines. The moment that would define everything did not arrive with a dramatic announcement. It crept in quietly, hidden inside a routine request for confirmation. A unit asked for clarification. Another asked for support that no longer existed. Signals went unanswered. Runners sent earlier never returned, and suddenly the truth became impossible to ignore. The army was blind, Kuchi, off, and standing on the edge of a catastrophic mistake. That was when all eyes finally turned to the man no one trusted, not because they believed in him, but because there was no one else left. Radios were dead. Vehicles couldn't pass. Air support couldn't see through the smoke. Technology had failed. Strategy had failed. And now, pride had to fail too. They called his name without confidence, without ceremony. The order was simple and terrifying. Deliver the message. Reach the isolated unit. Stop them from advancing into a trap that would annihilate them. No escort. No guarantee. No plan for extraction. Just a run through territory already collapsing under enemy pressure. In that moment, the useless messenger understood something the others did not yet grasp. If he failed, everyone would blame him. But if he succeeded, no one would ever know how close they came to losing everything. War does not reward those who prevent disasters. It only remembers those who survive them. And so he adjusted the strap on his satchel, memorized the message, and stepped forward into a role no one believed he deserved. What happened next would not just challenge the meaning of bravery. It would expose how fragile entire armies become when they underestimate the quietest man in the room. If you felt the tension building, you already understand why this story matters. Every second counted. Every step he took could mean life or death, not just for himself, but for hundreds of soldiers, depending on that single message. Take a moment now to reflect on that weight. Think about how often in history the smallest roles, the people overlooked, have turned the tide of battles. By leaving a comment, you're joining a conversation about courage, sacrifice, and the unseen heroes who changed everything when no one was watching. Hit that like button if the suspense of his mission kept you on edge. It tells YouTube to share this story with more viewers hungry for real, forgotten accounts of war. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications to stay connected. Stories like this don't wait. And neither should you. Share where you're watching from. And tell us if you've ever felt underestimated in a situation where your actions were the difference between disaster and survival. Your engagement keeps these untold histories alive and ensures that the bravery of men like this messenger is never forgotten. The battlefield stretched ahead like a living maze, jagged with debris, punctuated by the roar of artillery, and shrouded in smoke that smelled of gunpowder and fear. Every unit on the front line teetered on the edge of chaos, their movements frantic, their orders delayed, their coordination unraveling. Messages that should have guided them, that should have synchronized every advance and retreat, were trapped in broken radios and severed lines. The isolation was total. Without timely communication, soldiers acted blind, and commanders' plans dissolved into improvisation under fire. In that swirling storm of confusion, the messenger's role became painfully clear. He was no longer just a courier. He was the lifeline, the fate of entire squads. Their lives balanced precariously on his ability to traverse ground that had become lethal terrain overnight, rested squarely on his shoulders. As he moved forward, the dangers were immediate and relentless. Shrapnel from near misses whistled past, kicking dirt and debris into his face. Snipers, previously unseen, now stalked the ruins, their rifles trained on any movement. The messenger had to weave through destroyed buildings, across exposed roads, and along shell-pocked fields, calculating each step with the precision of a chess master who knew that one misstep could mean instant death. Yet, despite the terror, he advanced with measured determination. Every heartbeat, every breath, was synchronized with the rhythm of the battlefield around him. He became a ghost, moving through chaos, invisible, but essential, a paradox of being both unnoticed and utterly indispensable. The first obstacle appeared as he rounded the edge of a crater, shattered by an earlier bombardment. The gap was wide, the descent steep, and the bottom filled with water and mud. Each step risked a broken ankle or an undetected sniper positioned in a nearby ruin. He He hesitated for barely a second, enough to scan the area, locate cover, and plot the safest trajectory. Then he ran, leapt, and landed hard, mud spraying, his satchel shifting with the weight of the message. Behind him, the artillery fire surged, a reminder that hesitation was as dangerous as recklessness. He continued, each stretch of ground a gauntlet, each shadow a potential death sentence. And yet, forward he pressed, because he alone could bridge the gap between command and the isolated units, the difference between catastrophe and survival. As he advanced, a sudden explosion tore through the nearby earth, sending a plume of smoke and debris. "Skyward!" Soldiers screamed, and dust filled his lungs, burning with each inhalation. Instinct took over: dive, roll, and regain footing. But in that moment, he understood something crucial. Panic could kill more efficiently than bullets. The enemy depended on fear. His task depended on calm. So he forced his breath to slow, his focus to sharpen, and his mind to block everything but the path ahead. That discipline, forged from countless drills and hardened by prior assignments, allowed him to continue moving with terrifying efficiency. The battlefield around him was chaos incarnate, but his movements became a controlled rhythm, a dance of survival through a land where most men would have faltered. Every few hundred yards, he encountered remnants of the failed communications that had imperiled the army. Broken hagias, tangled wires, and scorched papers littered the path. Each artifact was a reminder of the stakes. Every minute lost, every misread order could cost lives. And yet, the messenger pressed on, knowing that the very act of delivering the message could reverse the course of events. He became the pivot upon which the army's immediate survival balanced. The soldiers ahead, unaware of the danger behind, depended entirely on him. The urgency compounded. There was no margin for error, no room for delay, and no second chances. The enemy, sensing the importance of the isolated units, began adjusting their tactics. Patrols grew more frequent. Observation points shifted. Small teams tried to intercept anyone attempting to traverse the exposed areas. The messenger realized that he was being hunted. The once invisible path now pulsed with peril. Each sound of movement could be a footstep, a rustle, a sniper preparing to take aim. Every decision when to run, when to pause, when to use cover could mean life or death. He adapted, changing pace, shifting routes, moving unpredictably to avoid detection, transforming the act of carrying a message into a tactical operation worthy of a seasoned soldier. Yet, amid the danger, a narrative of resilience unfolded. The messenger was proving a lesson to those who had dismissed him. Survival and impact in war are often dictated not by rank or reputation, but by skill, courage, and unwavering focus under pressure. Each successful yard he gained was a small victory, a reclamation of dignity and purpose that the command had long denied him. And with each step, the isolated units' chances of survival increased, not because of strategy or artillery, but because one man refused to be deemed useless. The mistake that doomed the army was not loud, dramatic, or immediate. It unfolded quietly, disguised as confidence. Hours earlier, a senior commander had approved an advance based on outdated intelligence, trusting that updated orders would arrive in time to correct any misalignment. They did not. The enemy had shifted positions during the night, pulling back from expected routes and reinforcing an entire different sector. What had once been a cautious push now became a blind march into a perfectly prepared trap. Trenches overlapped. Artillery coordinates were recalculated. kill zones were set, and the units at the front had no idea any of it had changed. By the time the truth surfaced, it was already too late to rely on standard corrections. The forward elements were moving deeper, their flanks exposed, their supply lines stretched thin. Radio operators tried again and again to raise command, adjusting frequencies, switching equipment, even sending out emergency signals. Nothing worked. The terrain absorbed transmissions like a sponge. Thick stone, elevation changes, and constant bombardment reduced even the strongest signals to static. Wire crews attempted repairs, only to be cut down before they could finish reconnecting a single line. Every traditional method of command and control collapsed within minutes. This was the moment when an entire army effectively became a collection of isolated groups, each acting on assumptions that were no longer true. Officers on the ground made decisions that made sense in the context they believed existed, not realizing that the battlefield had already transformed around them. Orders to advance were followed with discipline and courage. But discipline without information is a dangerous thing. Every step forward increased casualties. Every minute delayed the realization that they were walking straight into annihilation. The messenger understood this before anyone else fully grasped it. As he passed shattered positions and abandoned equipment, he saw patterns others missed. He recognized the signs of an enemy preparing for encirclement. The silence from friendly units ahead was not reassurance. It was a warning. He knew that if the message did not arrive soon, the forward units would reach a point of no return, a line beyond which retreat would be impossible under sustained fire. The message in his satchel was not just an update. It was an interruption, a chance to stop momentum before it became fatal. Halfway through his route, the consequences of the error became visible. Wounded soldiers staggered back in small numbers, confused, bleeding, unable to explain what had happened beyond fragmented words. Ambush, crossfire, too many guns. Their descriptions painted a picture far worse than command had imagined. The enemy was not reacting defensively. They were waiting, patient, prepared. The advance had triggered exactly what they wanted. And still, the bulk of the units moved forward, unaware that their orders were now obsolete. At this point, the mission shifted from urgent to desperate. Time was no longer measured in hours or even minutes. It was measured in steps. The messenger calculated distances instinctively, estimating how long it would take the leading units to reach the choke point ahead. He knew the terrain well enough to understand that once they crossed it, artillery could lock them in place. Reinforcements would be unable to reach them. Withdrawal would turn into slaughter. The realization hit with crushing clarity. If he failed now, no counterattack, no heroics, no air support would undo the damage. This was the last window. Enemy presence intensified. As he pushed deeper, patrols were closer now, moving with purpose, no longer searching randomly but actively sweeping likely routes. He had to slow down, choosing concealment over speed, knowing that capture or death would end the mission instantly. Each pause tested his nerves. Each movement risked detection. Yet every delay tightened the noose around the advancing units. The weight of responsibility became almost unbearable. Not abstract responsibility, but specific, human responsibility. Faces he had seen earlier, voices he had heard, men who trusted orders that no longer applied. The true horror of the mistake was not that it happened, but that it went unnoticed for so long. Armies prepare endlessly for enemy action, but rarely for their own assumptions turning against them. This failure did not come from cowardice or incompetence. It came from confidence placed in systems that had quietly failed. And now, only one man stood between that failure and total collapse. The messenger adjusted his route one last time, choosing a path that would bring him directly into the most dangerous stretch of ground. It was faster, but exposed. Safer options no longer existed. The situation demanded risk, not caution. As he moved forward, he knew that the next phase would be the most dangerous of all, because the enemy was no longer just an obstacle. They were actively closing in. There was a reason no one else had been sent. In fact, there were many. Each one, on its own, sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a wall that made the messenger's task not just unlikely, but almost impossible. The first option had been vehicles. Armored cars and motorcycles had once moved messages quickly across this sector. That advantage was gone. The roads were cratered, deliberately shelled by the enemy to deny movement. Bridges lay collapsed into rivers, choked with debris. Even light vehicles became death traps, visible from miles away and easily targeted by artillery observers who had already zeroed in on every usable route. Any engine noise now acted like a flare, drawing fire within seconds. Vehicles were ruled out early, not because they failed, but because they guaranteed detection. The second option was air support. A short-range drop, a low-altitude flyover. Something fast, something decisive. But smoke blanketed the battlefield in thick layers, rolling unpredictably with the wind. Anti-aircraft fire had intensified after the morning's first engagements. Pilots reported near misses and poor visibility, unable to identify friendly positions with confidence. A single mistake would risk bombing their own troops. Command knew better than to trade one disaster for another. These skies, like the roads, were closed. Then there were radios. Portable sets had been issued for exactly this kind of emergency, but theory collapsed under reality. Batteries drained faster in the cold and damp. Antennas snapped under debris. Frequencies overlapped with enemy jamming, turning messages into static or worse, broadcasting positions. Operators tried switching codes, adjusting power, relaying through intermediate units. Nothing held. Every attempt ended the same way. Silence. Radios became wait without purpose. Officers briefly considered sending a platoon-sized escort, pushing through by force. The idea died quickly. Movement in numbers attracted attention. Attention brought artillery. Artillery erased formations. The enemy was waiting for large targets. Anything that looked deliberate, organized, or important was met with overwhelming fire. A group would never get through. Not intact, not unnoticed. That left individuals, and Van Den, not just any individual, experienced. Scouts were already deployed elsewhere, pinned down or committed to holding fragile positions. Runners who had attempted similar routes earlier in the day had not returned. Whether they were wounded, captured, or killed was unknown. Their absence was message enough. Each failure narrowed the options further until the list collapsed in on itself. That was when the messenger became the only choice left, not because he was trusted, but because he was overlooked. He did not look important. He did not move like an officer. He carried no visible authority. To the enemy, he blended into the background noise of war. One more figure moving through ruins. One more shadow among hundreds. That invisibility, once mocked, was now his greatest weapon. Command didn't say this out loud. They didn't frame it as strategy. but the logic was clear. If anyone could slip through where everything else had failed, it would be the man no one noticed. The man whose presence never triggered urgency or response. The man the enemy would likely ignore until it was too late. What made the decision even more brutal was what it implied. If he failed, there would be no backup plan, no second attempt, no adjustment. The army had already burned through every alternative. His success or failure would not influence the outcome. It would decide it. As he moved deeper into contested ground, the absence of other messengers became obvious. No signals, no runners crossing paths, no signs of organized movement. He was alone in a way that felt absolute. That isolation sharpened his awareness. Every broken helmet, every abandoned pack, every darkened doorway told a story of attempts that had ended badly. This was not a route meant to be crossed. It was a boundary. Yet, paradoxically, this was why he could still move. The enemy had grown confident. Their patrols were aggressive but patterned, sweeping 4 groups, 4 formations, 4 signs of coordinated effort. A single figure moving cautiously, irregularly, did not match their expectations. War trains soldiers to recognize threats, and anything that does not fit that profile often slips through the cracks. Still, the margin for error shrank with every step. His pace slowed as the environment tightened. Urban ruins gave way to exposed stretches of land. Cover thinned. The sounds of battle grew sharper, closer. He could hear enemy voices, now close enough to distinguish tone if not words. He adjusted again, angling toward a narrow corridor that would save time but offer almost no protection. This was the point of no return. From here on, retreat would cost more time than pressing forward. If he was spotted now, he would have to run, and if he ran de messe, would likely never arrive. The decision was never announced as a moment of courage. It was delivered quietly, almost shamefully, as if speaking it too loudly would expose how desperate things had become. The officers exchanged looks that carried more weight than words. They knew what they were asking. They also knew what it said about the situation. An entire operation, months of planning, hundreds of lives, now depended on a man they had ignored for weeks. Not because he was the best option, but because he was the last one left. No one offered encouragement, no speech, no reassurance. Those things would have sounded dishonest anyway. The order came stripped of emotion, reduced to its raw core. Go, deliver this, do not stop, unless absolutely necessary. If you fail, there will be no second attempt. The subtext was clear. Failure would not be punished. It would simply be absorbed into the list of losses the war had already accepted. The messenger absorbed this without reaction. Inside, however, the reality settled heavily. This was no longer about completing a task. It was about choosing to move forward, knowing that every rational calculation said he should not survive. He understood the odds better than anyone giving the order. He had seen what happened to runners sent before him. He had passed their equipment, sometimes their bodies, sometimes nothing at all. War did not need witnesses to erase a man. What made the moment unbearable was not fear of death, but clarity. He knew exactly what would happen if he turned back. The forward units would advance as ordered. They would enter terrain already dominated by enemy fire. They would be cut apart in stages, confused, isolated, unable to retreat. Survivors would later be told they had done everything right. that explanation would not bring anyone back. So the choice was not between bravery and fear. It was between action and inevitability. He adjusted his route one final time, abandoning the safer approach in favor of a direct line that shaved precious minutes off the journey. Those minutes were now worth more than protection. He memorized landmarks, burned distances into his mind, calculated how long it would take the lead units to reach the choke point ahead. His body moved, but his mind stayed several steps ahead, rehearsing what he would say, how he would say it, how to convince exhausted officers to stop an advance already underway. As he moved, the battlefield responded. Enemy fire intensified, not randomly, but deliberately. The enemy sensed a shift. Patrols converged toward likely routes. The air felt tighter, heavier, as if the ground itself resisted movement. Every sound carried farther. Every movement risked drawing attention. He slowed, then stopped entirely, pressed flat against cold stone as a patrol passed within meters. Boots crunched. Voices murmured. A rifle barrel swept past his position, close enough that he could see scratches in the metal. When they moved on, he did not rush. Rushing created mistakes. Mistakes ended missions. Instead, he waited, counting breaths, letting his heart beat slow until it no longer felt like it would give him away. Then he moved again, not running, but flowing through the space the way water finds cracks. The burden of the message grew heavier with each step, even though its weight never changed. It was not just words. It was authority. It was interruption. It was the power to override momentum, something armies rarely do well once blood has been spilled. He knew some officers ahead would resist. Stopping an advance feels like failure. Continuing feels like resolve. Convincing them otherwise would require certainty, not hesitation. That certainty came from understanding something the planners did not. This was not a heroic moment waiting to be seized. It was a disaster waiting to be avoided, and avoiding disasters rarely earns applause. By the time the forward positions came into view, the sounds of combat were no longer distant. Rifle fire cracked in controlled bursts. Artillery thumped with mechanical rhythm. The advance was already in motion. He could see soldiers moving, preparing, adjusting equipment. They were minutes away from crossing the line that would trap them. There would be no dramatic entrance. No one was watching for him. No one expected him to arrive. And that, more than anything else, was what made what came next so dangerous. The moment he broke from cover, the battlefield seemed to notice him for the first time, not with alarms or shouted warnings, but with subtle shifts that only someone who had survived long enough learned to read. Fire patterns adjusted. Patrol routes tightened. The enemy was not reacting to him personally, but to probability. Something was moving where nothing should have been moving anymore. That alone was enough to turn the ground ahead into a killing field. He ran anyway. The distance between his position and the forward command post was no longer measured in yards, but in exposure. Every open stretch meant choosing speed over concealment. Every pause meant risking discovery by patrols, sweeping methodically closer. He sprinted when he had to, slowed when instinct screamed danger, and dropped flat when shells landed close enough to lift him off his feet. Dirt filled his mouth. Smoke burned his lungs. His legs ached, not from fatigue, but from tension held too long without release. Halfway through the run, the first shot cracked past him, not aimed. A warning. Someone had seen movement. He changed direction instantly, cutting hard to the left, then right, breaking rhythm the way he had learned from watching men die when they ran in straight lines. Another shot followed, closer. This time. The enemy had his general position now, if not his exact location. That was enough. From this point on, every second mattered more than caution. He pushed through a narrow corridor between collapsed structures, concrete scraping his shoulders, his satchel catching and tearing loose before he ripped it free. The message stayed secure. That was all that mattered. Behind him, boots hit rubble. Shouts followed. Not many. A small team. Confident. They believed they had him boxed in. They were wrong. He dropped without warning, rolling into a depression filled with debris and stagnant water, holding his breath as figures passed close enough that he could hear their breathing. One slipped. Another cursed. None of them looked down. The moment stretched impossibly long. Then they moved on, convinced he had continued forward. He did not. He waited, counting heartbeats, letting the danger drift past him. Then he reversed direction entirely, circling wide through ground that offered no cover but speed. His lungs burned. His vision narrowed. Every impact sent pain up his spine. Somewhere behind him, the enemy realized their mistake. Gunfire erupted again, this time wild, reactive, too late. The forward lines were close now. He could see friendly helmets, hear familiar voices. That should have meant safety. It did not. The most dangerous moment of any run is the last one. Complacency kills faster than bullets. He forced himself to keep scanning, to keep moving unpredictably. Even as exhaustion begged him to collapse, a shell landed behind him, close enough to throw him forward. He hit the ground hard, stars exploding in his vision. For a moment, everything went silent. Not quiet, empty. He pushed himself up on instinct alone, ignoring the pain in his ribs, ignoring the blood on his hands. If he stayed down now, none of it would matter. He stumbled into the perimeter just as soldiers turned, weapons raised, nearly firing, before recognizing him. No cheers. No relief. Just confusion. An unknown figure emerging from ground no one was supposed to cross alive. He did not waste time explaining where he had been or what it had cost. He spoke fast, clearly, with the authority of someone who knew there was no time for debate. The message changed hands. Orders were read. Faces shifted from irritation to disbelief, then to something colder, realization. They were minutes from disaster. Officers scrambled. Signals went out. Movements halted mid-preparation. Units already advancing were ordered to stop, then pull back, then reposition entirely. Confusion spread, but it was controlled confusion, far better than the alternative. The trap ahead remained lethal, but now it would be empty. Only when the momentum finally broke did anyone look back at the man who had delivered the interruption that saved them. He was already sitting against a wall, breathing hard, staring at nothing. The run was over. The consequences were just beginning. What happened next was not immediate chaos, but something far more dangerous: hesitation. Orders had been delivered, but belief lagged behind them. Some officers questioned the timing. Others questioned the source. A few questioned whether the situation had really changed enough to justify stopping an advance already paid for in blood. War trains leaders to push forward, not to pause. And yet, this pause was now the only thing standing between survival and slaughter. As units began to slow and reposition, the enemy reacted. They had expected bodies in the kill zone. Instead, they found empty ground. Artillery fire fell where men should have been. Machine guns opened up on nothing. Spotters adjusted coordinates again and again, trying to understand why the advance had evaporated at the last possible moment. The battlefield did not explode into violence. It tightened. Both sides sensed that something had shifted, but only one understood why. The messenger watched all of this from the edge of the command post, barely acknowledged, his role already fading into the background. He saw officers arguing over maps that were now minutes out of date. He heard fragments of conversation that revealed how close they had come to disaster. One position had been targeted for enfilade fire. Another was already bracketed by artillery. If the advance had continued, casualties would have been catastrophic within the first 10 minutes. Not a heroic loss, an unnecessary one. Then something went wrong. Ford. Company, too far ahead to receive the revised order in time, continued moving. They crossed into the outer edge of the trap, just as the enemy realized the main force had stopped. Fire shifted instantly. Precision replaced saturation. The sound of combat changed tone, sharper, more focused. Reports came in fragmented and panicked. Contact. Heavy resistance, taking fire from multiple directions. The command post froze. For a brief moment, the worst possibility returned. Half the message arrived too late. Had all this effort only delayed the inevitable, officers began issuing conflicting instructions, some ordering a push to support the trapped unit, others demanding an immediate withdrawal to avoid cascading losses. Confusion threatened to undo everything the messenger's run had achieved. The messenger moved. Without being told, he stepped back into the chaos he had just escaped, guiding a small group through a secondary route he had memorized during his run. He did not carry a weapon prominently. He did not issue commands with rank. He simply moved with certainty, and others followed because certainty is contagious under fire. He knew where the ground dipped, where cover existed, where the enemy's fields of fire overlapped, and where they did not. They reached the stranded company just as ammunition ran low. The situation was brutal, but not hopeless. The enemy had committed early, expecting a larger force to follow. When it didn't, their advantage narrowed. Smoke, grenades went out. Movement shifted. The trapped unit began pulling back in controlled bounds instead of breaking and running. It was not elegant. It was survival. From the enemy's perspective, everything had unraveled. A perfect trap had caught almost nothing. The one unit that did enter it slipped away before it could be crushed. Their firepower remained overwhelming, but their opportunity was gone. War is not decided only by strength. It is decided by timing. And timing had just betrayed them. The last of the isolated soldiers withdrew. The scale of what had been avoided finally became clear. Casualties were counted in dozens, not hundreds. Positions were re-established. The line held. What should have been a turning point for the enemy became a missed opportunity they would never get back. Still, there was no celebration. The battlefield moved on. New threats emerged. New orders replaced old ones. And the messenger, the man who had run through collapsing ground to interrupt disaster, faded back into the margins. No report listed his contribution in detail. No citation captured the chain of events he had broken. On paper, the army had simply adjusted its advance. When the firing finally slowed, the messenger faced a choice that no order had prepared him for. The message had been delivered. The immediate disaster had been interrupted. Technically, his duty was complete. He could have stayed behind the line, reported exhaustion, and disappeared back into the role everyone expected him to play. No one would have questioned it. No one would have blamed him. In war, survival alone is often considered success. But he understood something the maps still didn't show. The enemy had adjusted. They always did. Traps that fail once are not abandoned. They are reshaped. The terrain ahead remained dangerous, not because of where the enemy was, but because of where they could move next. If the army obeyed the letter of the new orders without understanding the spirit behind, then they would simply stumble into a different version of the same catastrophe. This was where obedience ended and judgment began. The revised plan called for a cautious repositioning, pulling back just enough to avoid immediate fire while preparing a renewed advance along a parallel route. On paper, it made sense. On the ground, it assumed the enemy would remain static. They would not. The messenger had seen the patrol patterns. He had felt how quickly the pressure shifted when momentum changed. He knew the enemy would anticipate the obvious adjustment and seed the secondary routes with ambushes before the units arrived. He brought this concern to an officer who outranked him by several levels. Not as a challenge. As a warning, the response was predictable. Caution mixed with skepticism. He was a runner, not an analyst, a survivor, not a strategist. His observations were noted politely and set aside. The machinery of command had already begun to move. That was the moment he made his decision. Instead of returning to the rear, he volunteered to move ahead again. This time, not as a messenger, but his eyes. He asked for permission to reconnoiter the alternate route to confirm whether it was as safe as the plan assumed. The request drew looks of disbelief. He had already done more than expected. Sending him again felt excessive, risky, unnecessary. But risk was the currency of the moment, whether acknowledged or not. He went anyway, slipping forward before the full movement began, using the same invisibility that had carried him through before. This run was quieter, slower, more deliberate. No sprinting, no desperate leap, just careful observation and memory layered on top of instinct. And what he found confirmed his fear. Fresh tracks, recently disturbed ground, firing positions not yet occupied, but prepared. The enemy was already thinking ahead, adjusting to the interruption they had not expected. If the units advanced as planned, they would not be annihilated in minutes, but bled over hours. A slower death, one that would be harder to explain, harder to stop once it began. When he returned, his report was different, not urgent, precise, specific. Locations, angles, timelines. He described not just where danger existed, but when it would materialize. That detail mattered. Officers stopped arguing and started listening. The plan shifted again, not dramatically, but decisively. Routes changed. Timing adjusted. The enemy's preparation was outpaced by minutes instead of lagging behind by hours. This was the moment the messenger truly chose between obedience and responsibility. He had crossed from following orders to shaping outcomes, not through authority, but through credibility earned under fire. The irony was sharp. The man once dismissed as useless had become the quiet hinge on which decisions now turned. When the next movement unfolded, it did so without drama. No ambushes, no sudden eruptions of fire. The enemy waited where no one came. And by the time they realized the army had slipped past their preparations again, the opportunity was gone. History would never record this as a brilliant maneuver. It would read as a cautious advance that met light resistance. But the absence of catastrophe was not accidental. It was the result of a choice made by someone who understood that sometimes the most important act in war is not to advance or retreat, but to refuse the obvious path. The impact of what the messenger had done was not visible on the battlefield itself. There was no single explosion, no dramatic counter, no moment that photographers would later point to and say, "This is where everything changed." Instead, the change showed up in what did not happen. No encirclement, no mass casualty reports flooding the command net, no frantic calls for emergency evacuation under collapsing fire. The battle continued, but it continued on terms that no longer favored the enemy. Hours later, intelligence reports began to confirm what only a few already sensed. Enemy artillery had been pre-registered on positions that were now empty. Machine gun nests covered routes no one had taken. Reserve units waited all day for an advance that never came. The enemy had prepared perfectly for a version of the battle that no longer existed. And by the time they tried to adapt, the window had closed. From the outside, it looked like restraint. Inside the command structure, it felt like relief mixed with unease. Officers reviewed casualty numbers and quietly recalculated what those numbers should have been. Entire companies that should have been shredded were intact. Units that should have been broken were reorganizing for the next phase. The margin between those two realities was not firepower or luck. It was timing. And timing had been rewritten by a man whose name still wasn't on any briefing slide. The messenger did not stay to hear these discussions. He returned to the background where he had always lived, cleaning mud from his boots, checking his satchel, waiting for the next order that might never come. That was how these moments usually ended. War absorbs outcomes, not causes. It records what happened, not what was prevented. Success without spectacle fades fast. Yet the ripple effects spread quietly. Subsequent movements were slower, more deliberate. Reconnaissance was prioritized. Routes were questioned instead of assumed. Commanders began asking for confirmation instead of relying solely on schedules. No one stood up and credited a single individual for this shift, but it happened anyway. Behavior changed. And in war, behavior is everything. The enemy, too, felt the change. Their confidence wavered. Plans that had been laid with precision failed to produce results. Patrollers found nothing where something should have been. Engagements turned indecisive. Pressure that should have broken the line instead dissolved into frustration. When an army loses momentum, it does not announce it. It simply stops dictating events. Later that night, as reports were consolidated, one senior officer paused over a timeline of the day's events. He traced the moment when the advance halted, when the alternate route was chosen, when contact was avoided instead of forced. For a brief moment, he asked the question that rarely makes it into official histories. Why did this work? The answer was uncomfortable. Because the army had listened to someone it usually ignored. Because it had allowed information to interrupt pride. Because it had accepted that survival sometimes depends on those farthest from authority. No citation was written that night. No recommendation submitted. The messenger's contribution was too fragmented, too indirect, too inconvenient to summarize cleanly. It lived in the negative space of reports, in the casualties that never happened, in the names that were never added to lists. But every man who walked away from that battlefield carried the consequence of his last run. Whether they knew it or not, the battle did not end that day, but it changed shape. And once momentum shifts in war, it rarely shifts back the same way. The recognition never arrived the way stories say it should. There was no ceremony held on a cleared field, no citation read aloud, no medal pinned while cameras clicked. When the reports were finalized, the battle was summarized in clean language: advance delayed, enemy positions avoided, casualties within acceptable limits. The words were correct. They were also incomplete. The messenger's name appeared once, buried in a log that listed personnel movements. No description, no explanation, just confirmation that he had been present, had delivered information, had returned. In the machinery of war, that was enough. Outcomes mattered more than authorship. Survival mattered more than credit. In the days that followed, the army moved on. New objectives replaced old ones. The terrain that had almost consumed them became just another mark on a map. Fresh units rotated in. Wounded were fallen were buried or carried away. Momentum resumed, and with it came the quiet erasure of the moment when everything had nearly collapsed. The messenger returned to his familiar place on the edge of attention. No one mocked him anymore, but no one praised him either. He was treated differently in subtler ways. Orders were clearer, questions were fewer. When he spoke, people listened a fraction longer than before, not because they understood what he had done, but because something in the way he moved, the way he observed, suggested that underestimating him had once come close to costing them everything. What remained was a lesson few would ever articulate. Armies prepare endlessly for firepower, numbers, and strategy, yet they often fail to measure the value of individuals whose impact cannot be graphed. The messenger did not win a battle. He did not destroy an enemy force. He did something far more difficult to recognize. He prevented a loss before it happened. Years later, if anyone tried to trace why that engagement unfolded the way it did, they would find no dramatic turning point, no single order that changed everything, just a sequence of small decisions that, taken together, shifted fate by inches. Those inches were enough. War history is filled with famous names and decisive actions. It is also filled with empty spaces where disasters were supposed to be. Those empty spaces are rarely explained. They exist because someone ran when others could not, because someone spoke when others dismissed it, because someone acted without waiting for permission to matter. The messenger never claimed heroism. He never corrected the record. When asked about that day, he would have struggled to explain it in the language people expected. There was no speech that captured the weight of carrying a message that might save hundreds or mean nothing at all. There was only movement, timing, and the refusal to stop when stopping would have been easier. That is how wars are often decided, not by those who are celebrated, but by those who are trusted too late and act anyway. If you stayed until the very end, you already understand why this story matters, not because of explosions or famous names, but because it reveals how wars are often decided by people history barely remembers. If this story made you see military history differently, take a second right now and subscribe to the channel. That simple action helps keep stories like this alive. Stories about overlooked individuals whose actions changed everything. If you made it this far, leave a like. It tells YouTube that this kind of deep, narrative-driven military history deserves to reach more people who care about what really happens behind the headlines. And I want to hear from you. Leave a comment with the word messenger if you believe the most important figures in war are often the ones no one is watching. Or tell us where you're watching from. Your comment isn't just engagement, it's proof that these forgotten moments still matter. Before you go, watch the next video appearing on your screen now. It continues this exploration of hidden decisions, overlooked tactics, and moments that quietly changed the course of history. Stay with us. The next story is already waiting.